Here's something that might blow your mind. The original screenplay for the first Pokemon movie featured a talking Mew, and it wasn't exactly the sweet, innocent creature you remember. Far from it, actually. This revelation comes straight from Takeshi Shudo himself, the film's head screenwriter, who detailed this fascinating creative decision in one of his Japanese blog entries that we've had translated. The early script painted Mew as something quite different from what audiences eventually saw on screen. In those initial drafts, Mew repeatedly taunted Mewtwo with cutting remarks about its artificial origins. The psychic feline would essentially tell its clone, "You're just a copy, nothing more." These barbs were specifically crafted to provoke Mewtwo's deepest insecurity, stoking an intense rivalry rooted in existential crisis. Shudo described these exchanges as philosophical confrontations, debates about identity, authenticity, and the fundamental right to exist. Mew's personality in this version was deliberately antagonistic, almost malicious. The screenwriter characterized it as simultaneously violent and unpredictable, while maintaining that deceptively adorable exterior. That contradiction, looking harmless while delivering psychological warfare, made Mew's attacks particularly devastating. Picture something that appears completely non-threatening, systematically dismantling someone's sense of self-worth. That's the effect Shudo was going for. The production team struggled significantly with this concept. How do you voice act something that needs to sound both childlike and cruel? The technical challenge proved too difficult, so they pivoted. In the final version, Mew simply flies around looking cute while saying its name. Standard Pokemon fare. But here's the thing, removing the dialogue didn't change Shudo's underlying intention. He made this crystal clear in another blog post, stating that those original confrontational lines weren't wasted effort. They served a crucial purpose during development, helping the director and animation staff understand both Pokemon's true motivations. According to Shudo, Mew's silent attitude in the final film still communicates the same message. Copies are inferior. I won't acknowledge the existence of something created by humans. Both Pokemon, in Shudo's vision, harbor resentment toward humanity for forcing this unnatural connection between them. So, if you've always imagined Mew as purely benevolent, think again. That's merely surface-level presentation. Underneath that soft, approachable design lurks what Shudo explicitly called a cruel, violent, and unpredictable personality. The first Pokemon movie's development history gets even more interesting when you look at how it was originally conceived. According to another blog entry we've translated from Shudo, the film was initially designed as a direct sequel to a television episode he'd planned to write himself. This unmade episode would have established Mewtwo's complete backstory and featured a confrontation with Ash. That's the entire reason behind the movie's title. Mewtwo Strikes Back implies retaliation for something that already happened. It's a revenge narrative, but for events that were supposed to occur in a TV episode, audiences never got to see. Interestingly, they settled on the title before actually developing the story. Shudo explained their logic. Based on the Japanese TV broadcast schedule, Mewtwo should have already made its anime debut by the time the film premiered. The audience would have already witnessed this legendary Pokemon face-off against the main character, perhaps even suffer defeat. So they decided, let's build a revenge story around that. One of the Star Wars films had used The Empire Strikes Back as its title, which Shudo thought had a great ring to it. They borrowed that structure for Pokemon's first theatrical release. Pre-production began moving forward. Then disaster struck. An episode featuring Porygon, with its infamous flashing light sequences, triggered seizures in thousands of Japanese children. This incident, now known as the Pokemon Shock, forced the entire anime off Japanese television for 4 months due to health concerns and regulatory review. By the time Pokemon returned to broadcast, the production timeline had been thrown into complete chaos. The schedules were so thoroughly disrupted that Shudo's planned Mewtwo backstory episode never got produced. To be clear, Mewtwo did eventually appear in episodes that aired several months after the movie's release. But these weren't the episodes Shudo originally envisioned. That specific backstory episode was never even written. Consequently, the movie's revenge angle shifted. Instead of Mewtwo seeking vengeance against Ash, the target became Mewtwo's creators themselves, the humans who brought it into existence. During these early writing stages, studio executives made a casting decision that would permanently shape how the world perceives Mewtwo. They hired Masachika Ichimura to voice the character. Ichimura had starred as the Phantom in Japan's theatrical production of The Phantom of the Opera, and Shudo was absolutely thrilled to have him attached to the project. With Ichimura in mind, Shudo essentially wrote Mewtwo as a Pokemon version of the Phantom, a tragic figure with a dark history who isolates himself from society. Controlling, secretive, highly intelligent, perceived by outsiders as frightening and evil, yet internally tormented by existential loneliness and questions about his right to exist. Shudo even gave Mewtwo a castle, mirroring the Phantom's opera house. When Ichimura began preparing for the role, he approached Shudo and asked directly, "Mewtwo's character is the Phantom of the Opera, right?" Shudo nodded and quietly confirmed, "You're exactly like the Phantom of the Opera." Most international fans have never heard Ichimura's performance, though it's genuinely excellent and worth seeking out. But his casting created a lasting impact that extends far beyond that first movie. It fundamentally shaped how fans worldwide perceive Mewtwo to this day. Consider what could have been. Working only from Generation 1 game sprites and minimal lore, Shudo could have easily written Mewtwo as a standard comic book supervillain or even a mindless monster incapable of speech. Instead, thanks to the Phantom of the Opera and how it inspired Shudo's creative direction, Mewtwo became permanently defined by those traits. Dark, brooding, isolated, and deeply philosophical. Speaking of Mewtwo's castle from the first film, it's located on New Island, an exclusive location created specifically for the movie. But the film itself never explains where this place actually sits within the Pokemon world's geography. However, we got answers a couple years later through some Japanese publications. Official books released in Japan featured detailed maps of the Orange Islands archipelago, and these maps finally revealed New Island's precise location. It's actually positioned southwest of Cinnabar Island. So there you have it, a seemingly minor detail that took years to be officially documented, but it helps complete the picture of Kanto's extended geography. Here's where Pokemon crosses over into the real world in a fascinating way. In 2020, a scientist named Yun Xiao discovered 3 previously unidentified beetle species in Australia. The names he chose for them: Binburum articuno, Binburum zapdos, and Binburum moltres. We reached out to Dr. Yun directly to learn more about this decision. His response beautifully captures the intersection between popular culture and scientific work. "I've always believed it's valuable to connect popular culture with biotaxonomy," he told us. "It raises public awareness about conservation and the incredible diversity within Earth's ecosystems. The biodiversity in the Pokemon world actually mirrors real-world diversity, which I deeply appreciate." He explained that when his team identified 3 new species simultaneously, the concept of 3 legendary Pokemon, a pattern that appears in every generation, immediately came to mind. Since Generation 1 represented his first exposure to Pokemon and left the strongest impression on him, he selected those 3 iconic birds for the naming honors. The backstory of these beetles adds another layer of intrigue. They'd actually been sitting in a museum collection since the 1990s, completely unidentified until Yun's discovery. Their exact wild habitat remains unknown to this day, which makes their classification of habitat unknown oddly fitting, just like the legendary Pokemon they're named after. Their scarcity provided another reason for the legendary bird connection. As Yun put it, these beetles are as rare as legendary Pokemon. They're so uncommon that no video footage of living specimens even exists. All we have is a single photograph. There's also a peculiar detail about the digital legendary birds themselves worth mentioning. In the original red, blue, and green versions, all 3 legendary birds had 8 toes, except Zapdos, which only had 6. But later on, Zapdos mysteriously sprouted 2 additional toes in a stealth update, bringing it into parity with Articuno and Moltres. A small change, but one that sharp-eyed fans definitely noticed. Speaking of early Generation 1 designs, let's talk about some beta sprites that almost made it into the games. The November 1996 issue of CoroCoro magazine marked the very first public announcement of Pokemon Blue. That magazine showcased several beta sprites that were planned for Blue's release, but ended up getting replaced at the last minute. One of these was an alternate Mewtwo design. Honestly, We think this unused sprite represents a significant improvement over the Mewtwo design that actually made it into the final version, not just in Japanese blue, but also in the red and blue versions that launched internationally. The beta sprite has more visual presence and personality. An unused blue sprite for Mew was also uncovered during a 2019 leak of prototype development assets. But even more intriguing were a couple of early Celebi designs discovered in leaks from Generation 2's development phase. The first Celebi design is clearly modeled after Kokopelli, a Native American fertility deity known for trickster behavior. Kokopelli's origins trace back over 1,000 years. This god presided over childbirth and agriculture, and also embodied the spirit of music. According to legend, playing his flute could banish winter and bring forth spring. The second leaked Celebi sprite, while somewhat less obvious in its inspiration, still displays strong Kokopelli influences and maintains distinct Native American visual motifs. Game Freak has never publicly commented on these leaked sprites, but fans have developed theories about why these designs got scrapped. One possibility: concern about cultural sensitivity. Kokopelli was primarily worshipped by the Hopi tribe, who still exist today but were devastated during colonization. Game Freak might have realized that transforming their deity into a Pokemon character could be problematic. Alternatively, they may have simply decided to take Celebi's design in a completely different creative direction, independent of any cultural concerns. While Game Freak never addressed those beta Kokopelli-inspired sprites, they have shared some information about Celebi's actual development process. Junichi Masuda revealed on his blog that the team decided early on to give Celebi a nature-based theme. Beyond that basic direction, official details remained sparse for years until 2018, when Game Freak's official YouTube channel posted an interview that shed much more light on the subject. We've translated that Japanese interview into English. In the video, Hironobu Yoshida explains that he joined the team as a new Pokemon designer for Generation 2. His very first assignment involved creating 3 Pokemon: Wobbuffet, Dunsparce, and Celebi. Presumably, that nature theme Masuda mentioned was part of the design brief handed to him. Yoshida describes his reaction. "When I started working, I noticed Celebi was positioned at the bottom of the Pokédex list. I asked why, and they told me it was going to be a legendary Pokemon, the same concept as Mew. So I aimed to design something small, cute, and fairy-like, similar to Mew. That's how Celebi came to be." The interview continues with Yoshida, Morimoto, and Uno discussing an interesting parallel to Generation 1. Just as the Mew under the truck rumors captivated Gen 1 players, a new rumor emerged after Gold and Silver launched. Players could find Celebi at the shrine in Ilex Forest. Shigeki Morimoto, the developer who secretly added Mew into Gen 1, earning himself a bit of a prankster reputation, immediately became the prime suspect. Everyone at Game Freak accused him. "You didn't slip that in there, did you? What did you do?" But Morimoto was completely innocent this time. The rumor was entirely fabricated by fans, and nobody at Game Freak had any idea how it started. Then someone had a realization. That's actually kind of interesting. So when they developed Crystal a year later, they added an actual in-game event where players could legitimately catch Celebi at the Ilex Forest Shrine. The mysterious fan rumor became reality. At this point in the interview, the interviewers had a sudden realization. The shrine had absolutely zero function in the original Gold and Silver versions. They asked the obvious question, so why did that shrine even exist in the first place? According to the developers, even they don't know the answer to that question, which just makes the Celebi rumor phenomenon even more mysterious and fascinating. Have you ever wondered why Ho-Oh appeared in the very first episode of the Pokemon anime, years before Gold and Silver even launched in Japan? According to Takeshi Shudo, the explanation is refreshingly straightforward: pure marketing strategy. That's literally all there was to it. In a couple of his blog posts, Shudo explained the situation. "When I began writing the script, I was informed that the second generation of Pokemon games was approaching completion. Some people felt that Ho-Oh should be shown as a draw for the entire series, even if only for a few seconds. So we added the scene in. Simple as that. No deep creative reasoning, no elaborate narrative purpose, just a smart promotional decision to build hype for the upcoming games by giving audiences a tantalizing glimpse of what was coming next." It's actually a pretty clever piece of cross-media marketing when you think about it. Kids watching the anime in 1997 had no idea what that mysterious golden bird was, but it planted a seed of curiosity that wouldn't be satisfied until Gold and Silver released years later. Now let's examine the relationship between Ho-Oh and Lugia. You've probably already heard about their connection to real-life Japanese temples. For today, we're focusing specifically on the opposing forces these two legendary Pokémon represent. A 2009 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine featured an extensive 8-page interview we've translated, where top developers sat down to promote Heart Gold and Soul Silver's release. The interviewer posed this thought-provoking question. This is a deep question about the world. Gruden and Kyogre represent land and sea. Dialga and Palkia embody time and space. And it seems like every legendary Pokémon has an exact opposite. Are Ho-Oh and Lugia opposites? Their response. There's no direct relationship between Ho-Oh and Lugia within the story itself. But regarding their conceptual motifs, they represent the sun and the moon, or day and night. That's how we picture them, like light and shadow, the sky and the ocean's depths above and below. That's their fundamental meaning. So basically they function as opposites in the sense that they embody day versus night and sky versus sea. Pretty interesting on its own, but what they said next really caught our attention. Kenji Matsushima, who served as game designer on both Gold and Silver and their remakes, added, when Ho-Oh and Lugia first appeared on Game Boy, they had time-related abilities. That concept remains unchanged in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Wait, time-related abilities? That's curious, because Celebi is explicitly the time-traveling Pokémon, not Ho-Oh and Lugia. Ho-Oh can learn Sunny Day and Lugia can learn Rain Dance, but those are weather moves, not time manipulation. So what was Matsushima actually referring to? Looking through their Generation 2 movesets, two attacks stand out, a Future Sight and Ancient Power. It's worth noting that in Japanese, Ancient Power translates more accurately to Primeval Power. Not just ancient, but representing the very earliest stages of Earth's history. Much more time-focused than the English name suggests. Both Future Sight and Ancient Power were introduced in Generation 2, alongside the concept of time itself within the Pokémon world. Gold and Silver implemented a real-time clock and day-night cycle for the first time in the series. Even more intriguing, Celebi also learns both Future Sight and Ancient Power. All three Pokémon with these time-related abilities are grouped together at the end of the Pokédex. Lugia representing night, Ho-Oh representing day, and Celebi representing time travel itself. You could argue that together, these three legendaries comprise a sort of time trio, similar to Gen 3's Weather Trio, Gen 4's Creation Trio, and Gen 5's Tau Trio. Those trios also have two Pokémon more closely linked with a third that's slightly more independent. Now, Time Trio isn't an official term currently used by the fandom, and it doesn't even have a Bulbapedia page. But it's worth noting that the Weather Trio, Creation Trio, and Tau Trio all have Bulbapedia pages, yet none of those terms are actually official either. They were all created by fans to categorize groups of Pokémon. In that regard, the concept of a Time Trio is just as official as all the others, which is to say not official at all. But it's a fun and potentially useful method of categorization that makes thematic sense. Speaking of fan-made terminology, let's move on to the legendary beasts, which, even though that's not an official designation, immediately tells you exactly which Pokémon we're talking about. There's been a long-standing debate within the fanbase. Are they legendary dogs or legendary cats? Their early sprites from Gold and Silver's 1997 Space World demo leaked online in 2018, revealing significantly more canine-looking designs. However, they underwent dramatic transformations over the subsequent 2 years of development, resulting in 3 Pokémon that are almost unrecognizable compared to their original species design. In 2012, their designer Muneo Saito shed some light on the famous cat versus dog question through a Twitter thread we've translated. Art director Ken Sugimori initiated the conversation, saying, "Let's try asking Muneo Saito, do Raikou, Entei, and Suicune have any animals they are based on? Like, people say they're based on dogs or something." Saito's response revealed his entire creative process. At the time, I already had a vision in my head for Entei. I'd been rolling that vision around for a while, trying to figure out how to connect Suicune and Raikou's designs, but it wasn't really coming together. I'm a manga artist, so I approached things from a character creation perspective. I thought about the story behind the Pokemon and worked backwards to determine what features they needed. He continued, so, a king with a majestic mustache, a rock-like body covered in thick hair, and volcanic smoke rising from behind its head. Entei's design was taking shape. It basically looked like a lion, but I didn't want it resembling any single animal too closely, so I settled on a silhouette that could look like either a dog or a cat, or neither. After establishing Entei, he moved on. I settled on tiger-like and leopard-like designs for Raikou and Suicune. Suicune came together easily, but Raikou's design took numerous twists and turns to get right. There was even a blue thunder version with a drum on its back. Saito concluded, basically there are direct tiger and lion motifs, but the main idea is that they're designed to be spirits responsible for each element. Or rather, I aimed to make them like distinguished gods. So there you have it. They're primarily based on cats. Entei's a lion, Raikou's a tiger, and Suicune's a leopard. But Saito also deliberately made their silhouettes ambiguous, so there's still some wiggle room for fans who refuse to accept their cats. We should also note that 2022 was the year of the tiger in the Japanese zodiac, which is why Pokemon designers like Saya Tsuruta and Ken Sugimori tweeted out brand new Raikou artwork to celebrate the new year. Because it's a tiger. They're cats, folks, we promise. They're not dogs. In that Twitter thread, Muneo Saito also mentioned an earlier Raikou design, that Blue Thunder version with a drum on its back. Some YouTubers have claimed that certain Saito artwork depicts this early design, but that doesn't appear accurate. For one thing, there aren't any drums visible. By the way, Saito probably wasn't referring to modern drum kits. He's talking about Japanese-style drums carried by Raijin, the Japanese god of thunder. Also, Saito actually responded to one of our tweets a few years ago, explaining he created that particular artwork to promote a character design class he taught in 2014. The website promoting his class also featured Saito's artwork for a bipedal dragon, jellyfish fruits, a popcorn family, and a psychedelic orchard. They're all interesting and possibly inspired by unused Pokemon concepts from his time at Game Freak, but this doesn't appear to be the Blue Thunder Raikou he mentioned to Sugimori. Blue Raikou has never been made public, not even in a leak. Releasing it himself would put Saito in extremely hot water with Pokemon's legal team. So it seems fans will probably never get a chance to see that long-lost legendary design. Moving on to Generation 3, you probably already know that Deoxys' design was inspired by DNA. The Pokédex even classifies it as the DNA Pokemon. But you might not have realized that its 4 forms actually spell it out literally. The defense form, normal form, attack form, and speed form. Taken together, their initials form an acronym for DNAS. A clever hidden detail most players probably never noticed. In Generation 3, Deoxys can only be found on Birth Island, which is geographically isolated from the other Sevii Islands. This location is based on the real-life island of Minamitorishima, which is similarly isolated. The nearest Japanese island lies more than 700 miles away. This far-flung island had no inhabitants, and it was claimed by the US government back in 1889. Why? Because it was covered in guano, basically just bird droppings, but valuable at the time for fertilizer production. The Japanese and American governments argued over ownership of this tiny poop-covered island for decades, especially as its location became militarily strategic. America bombed it heavily during World War II. The US took control of Minamitorishima soon after, but eventually decided they didn't really care about it anymore and returned it to Japan. In 2015, the now deserted island mysteriously vanished from satellite images. The Japanese Coast Guard stated, there is a possibility that the islet has been eroded by wind and snow, and as a result disappeared. Conspiracy theories spread that a government cover-up was underway, possibly centered around military technology. But the island quickly reappeared soon after, making headlines for an even bigger reason. Huge deposits of rare earth minerals were discovered in the island's mud, potentially enough to supply the world for centuries. There's a strong chance that someday the screen on your smartphone will be manufactured from minerals extracted from Minamitorishima, not to mention key components in hybrid cars and missile systems. In other words, the real-life home of Deoxys is one of the most mysterious and strategically important islands on the entire planet. Ever wonder why Latios and Latios are psychic and dragon types instead of having flying as one of their types? We have heard Shigeki Morimoto's explanation for why Lugia is half psychic instead of half water. Basically, because psychic Pokemon were extremely powerful in the early generations. They made it psychic Sasor flying, not for design or lore reasons, but purely to make it competitively strong. In a 2018 interview, Morimoto explained that essentially the same reasoning applied to Latias and Latios not being flying types. When we were deciding their types, we wanted to give them Psychic type and Dragon type to really express their strength. But once we did that, we looked at them and knew they needed to fly, yet we couldn't give them the Flying type too. So we ended up giving them the Levitate ability instead. So there you have it. A design decision driven entirely by game mechanics and competitive balance rather than thematic consistency. They needed to fly visually but couldn't have 3 types, so Levitate became the elegant solution. Rayquaza's got a pink tongue in all its official artwork, but early sprites actually depicted it with a blue tongue instead. The blue coloration appears clearly in all the Generation 3 games, Pinball, Ruby, and Sapphire, and even Generation 4's beta builds. But after Diamond and Pearl hit store shelves, Rayquaza's blue tongue vanished completely. It was never seen again. Staying on the topic of Rayquaza's color, a special shiny Rayquaza was released exclusively in Japan. Pokémon Conquest was a tactical RPG spin-off that launched in 2012, featuring feudal warlord Nobunaga, essentially serving as the game's villain. He seeks to conquer the Ransei region through military force. In the final mission, he summons a Black Rayquaza to serve as the game's ultimate boss battle. To promote Pokémon Conquest's release in Japan, a Black Rayquaza was distributed over Wi-Fi, but only to Japanese copies of Black and White. This Rayquaza had its original trainer listed as the Warlord Nobunaga himself, making it a truly unique event Pokémon. Since this distribution was limited to Japan and the event has long since ended, Nobunaga's Black Rayquaza remains one of the rarest event Pokémon in existence. We don't have much to say about Generation 3's other legendaries that hasn't already been covered, so let's move ahead to Generation 4, the generation most heavily focused on its legendary Pokémon. According to the game's director Junichi Masuda, I decided that Ultimate was the theme from the very beginning of Gen 4's development. The key element was creating the storyline around the Pokémon in Sinnoh mythology. The relationship between all these Pokémon is the key element I wanted to express, the importance of balance between substance and spirit. He elaborated, Dialga, the ruler of time, and Palkia, the ruler of space, represent substance. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf represent spirit. If the substance becomes too large, the balance of spirit collapses. I wanted Dialga and Palkia to become counterparts for a sense of balance. Infinite time and infinite space. That, to me, is the ultimate. In another issue of Nintendo Dream Magazine, art director Ken Sugimori explains that Dialga and Palkia were created based on direct instructions from Masuda. They deliberately went out of their way to make dragons that, unlike earlier designs such as Dragonite, Salamence, and even Charizard, represented a drastic departure from conventional fantasy world dragons. That's why they don't resemble the scaly lizards you'd typically see in Western or even Eastern mythology. It was an intentional break from tradition. To create Giratina's origin form and the distortion world, the developers borrowed a concept from Japanese culture. After directing Diamond and Pearl as the ultimate Pokémon games, Masuda felt they had to go even bigger for Platinum. He instructed Platinum's director, Takeshi Kawachimaru, to use antimatter and Sakasafuji as inspiration to create the distortion world. Sakasafuji translates to reversed Mount Fuji, the concept of Mount Fuji's reflection in the lake beneath it. A distorted reflection of reality. Trying to explain it, Masuda said, "It exists, but it actually doesn't. It doesn't exist, but it does." That sort of thing. The mountain exists on the lake through human eyes, but it's only a reflection and doesn't exist. It's a diverse world you see only because you're looking at it with your own eyes. When designing Giratina's origin form, they paid meticulous attention to the character's details. Their designer redrew Giratina's image repeatedly to make it truly feel like a Pokémon from the antimatter world. When Pokémon Legends Arceus released, fans were initially perplexed by the new origin forms for Dialga and Palkia, but they finally made sense when Japanese fans realized something incredible. If you combine them with origin form Giratina, all three fit together to make Arceus. There's actually some lore about their origin forms that wasn't included in the game itself, but was published on the game's official website. For Palkia, it says, "They say that the very space in the world where origin form Palkia resides is in shreds, as if it had been torn to ribbons." For Dialga, the flow of time is said to be in constant flux in the world where origin form Dialga resides, always moving in different directions and different speeds. Dialga also received a unique form never included in the mainline series, Primal Dialga, who only appeared in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky. In an alternate future timeline, the Time Gears are stolen from Dialga's home, the Temporal Tower. This strips Dialga of its powers of time control, along with its ability to express logic, reason, and even mercy. In other words, it's not as powerful as normal Dialga, but compensates with mindless villainy driven purely by primal instinct. Besides its unique lore attributes, it also differs in coloration. Primal Dialga was also the antagonist in the Blazing Exploration Team manga, and made a brief appearance in the Beyond Time and Darkness anime special. But since it's only been seen in the PMD side series and not in over a decade, it's probably not considered canon to the mainline franchise. Since we're already on the topic of non-canon legendary forms, let's wrap up with a couple more from the series' history. First announced in a 2015 teaser trailer, Shadow Mewtwo was designed first and foremost by Bandai Namco, the developers of Pokken Tournament. However, Game Freak and the Pokemon Company contributed to the design as well. According to the lore, after a plot device called the Shadow Synergy Stone merges with and corrupts Mewtwo, it transforms into Shadow Mewtwo. In this form, it flies around the Farum region draining Synergy to become even more powerful. Additionally, it can essentially Mega Evolve into its Mega X form, although the game doesn't officially call it that. According to Pokken's producer Katsuhiro Harada, when we were originally coming up with the design, we worked very closely with the Pokemon Company and Game Freak to make sure everything was right. What happened was we at Bandai Namco had the idea of making a really cool dark-colored Mewtwo. So we had one of our designers take a crack at it, then presented that to the Pokemon Company and Game Freak. They all thought it looked really cool, so then we worked together to refine it. Harada added, "Because everyone really likes Shadow Mewtwo, I have a personal hope Game Freak will continue to use it. But it's not really our decision." Unfortunately for those designers, Shadow Mewtwo never appeared in any other games after Pokken Tournament. When Polygon asked the Pokemon Company in 2016 whether Shadow Mewtwo was canon or not, they were met with a very non-committal reply. No comment. An even lesser-known variant is Fragment Mew. It was created by famous Japanese designer and musician Hiroshi Fujiwara in a partnership with the Pokemon Company called the Thunderbolt Project. Fujiwara is renowned for making streetwear fashion, so his Mew design was plastered on shirts, hoodies, hats, and turned into plushies. Even Mew's original creator, Shigeki Morimoto, was a fan. He appeared on Game Freak's official Japanese YouTube channel wearing a Fragment Mew t-shirt. Actually, that was the episode where Morimoto explained how he made Mew back in the 90s. Fragment Mew's official artwork was never released digitally. Mew served as the project's mascot and received the most unique artwork, but a few other Pokemon appeared on Thunderbolt merchandise too, like Mewtwo, the Kanto starters, and Pikachu. You could say Thunderbolt Pokemon are sort of their own special variants, kind of like Shadow Pokemon. But even though they're officially licensed Pokemon products, they probably can't be considered canon, though there's certainly an interesting footnote in Pokemon history. Unfortunately, they're also incredibly rare pieces of history. Many of them were sold at limited-time pop-up shops in places like Japan and New York. So if you want to get your hands on one nowadays, you'll probably have to fight like a wild dog for it on eBay. Did you know Mew was inspired by an invisible F-4 Phantom fighter jet and a dog that never existed? We know this sounds bizarre, but it's the truth. So buckle up for about 50 years worth of backstory. It's often said that Gen 1 programmer Shigeki Morimoto inserted Mew into Red and Green as a prank. But that's only a very small piece of the story, and it's not even entirely accurate. The idea for Mew actually came from Satoshi Tajiri, Game Freak's founder and the creator of the Pokemon franchise. Tajiri is incredibly reclusive and rarely grants interviews, but he did sit down for one massive interview at Game Freak headquarters in May 2000, which was later published as 34 pages in a Japan-exclusive book called Pokemon Story. Those 34 pages were translated into English. These show Tajiri's rather bizarre but also completely ingenious explanation for why he came up with Mew. As a teenager, Tajiri frequently skipped school to spend all day at the local arcade. He fell in love with games like Space Invaders and Xevious, two space shooters he obsessively played in massive marathon sessions. In the interview, he said, "I would really try and take these games on, going at it for 12 hours at a time." At the time, I thought, I'm the only guy who's doing this. But in reality, guys like me were springing up all over Japan, and we started to wonder what made the game tick. When that information started making the rounds as schoolyard rumors, there was a big mixture of truths and half-truths. Xevious was originally designed as a game about the Vietnam War, but adopted a sci-fi theme during development. An F-4 Phantom fighter jet remained in Xevious's internal data as a leftover from its Vietnam roots, but it could never actually be seen by the player. This led to urban legends that while playing Xevious, there was a 1 in a million chance you'd see an F-4 Phantom. A Space Invaders legend claimed you could fire a perfect shot down the middle to hit the invader in the back for 1,500 points. Video game magazines heard these rumors and reported them as fact, which convinced Tajiri and his peers that the rumors were true. Tajiri explains further. There were tons of surreal rumors out there, like a dog running across the screen. Nobody could confirm most of these rumors. You'd hear a friend of a friend down in Chiba says he totally saw the dog. And you'd think, did he really? There were always things you couldn't verify. I had tons of experiences like that. So when I was making Pokemon, I wondered what kind of legends might spring up. I heard this or that could appear if you do this or something. Let people's imaginations run wild. With those urban legends in mind, I came up with Mew, a character that exists but doesn't appear, just like the F-4 Phantom. Legends get talked about and live on. It's these kinds of urban legends that spread through word of mouth that you really feel in your bones. He goes on to say that what makes Mew special is that unlike the F-4 Phantom, players can actually catch and keep it for themselves, or trade it to a friend. So it lives on forever instead of appearing for a brief, fleeting moment. So Mew was actually Tajiri's idea, not Morimoto's. But what about the design itself? To hear Morimoto's side of the story, we need to move over to Game Freak's official YouTube channel. The channel was created in 2018, and top developers like Junichi Masuda practically begged their fans to subscribe to it. But as of 2021, they'd still only managed to pull in 40,000 subscribers. Despite its low view counts, there are actually some hidden gems in there, including 2 interviews with Morimoto where he revealed some secrets about Mew's creation. They're all in Japanese without subtitles, so we translated both videos as well. According to Morimoto, Game Freak wanted a Pokemon that could serve as Mewtwo's origin. Red and Green already had references to Mew scattered throughout Cinnabar's Pokemon Mansion, but Mew didn't have a sprite, stats, or anything tangible. In that sense, it was sort of like the original dragon from Gen 5, a creature you hear stories about but only exists for the sake of the game's lore. You never get to see it. After Pokemon's 6-year development, Nintendo spent a fortune debugging the game. In another interview, Tajiri says it was the most expensive debugging process in Nintendo history. Game Freak was under strict orders not to tamper with the game after debugging was complete. But removing the debug features freed up a tiny amount of space on the cartridge, about 300 bytes. Game Freak already had to cut lots of Pokemon so Red and Green could fit on a Game Boy cartridge, but now they had just enough space left over to squeeze in one more Pokemon. Originally, it was supposed to be Ken Sugimori who would design Mew. After all, he was the guy who designed Mewtwo and served as art director, so it was natural he'd do the honors. Then, as the programmer, it was Morimoto's job to physically add Mew into the game. But as Morimoto explains it, I asked Sugimori if he could design it, but he never made time to do it for me. There was no time left, like Mew had to get put into the game now or it wasn't going to happen. I had no choice but to design it myself. I made its Pokédex entry and its stats and all that, then I just put it in. He goes on to explain why Mew's design is so small and simple. 300 bytes just wasn't enough space for a large and detailed Pokemon sprite. So while Mewtwo and the legendary birds have sprites that are 56 pixels squared, Mew's sprite is only 40 pixels. Morimoto says there wasn't even enough space to color it in, which is why the Mew we know today is pretty much one solid color. Morimoto notes that even though the lore says Mewtwo was created as Mew's clone, in reality the opposite is true. Mewtwo came first, and Mew was created essentially as a simplified clone of Mewtwo. Everyone at Game Freak was in on the plan, but no one told Nintendo. They eventually found out when fans started encountering a glitch that made Mew appear in their games. Nintendo was furious. But their anger subsided pretty quickly as urban legends about Mew lit up the imagination of fans, just as the dogs and phantoms had done for Xevious a decade earlier. Red and Green sold decently right out of the gate, but sales exploded as rumors about a secret 150th Pokemon started spreading around Japanese playgrounds. According to Pokemon Company president Tsunekazu Ishihara, the monthly sales we had had up to then began to be equaled by weekly sales, before increasing to become 3, then 4 times larger. By the time it ranked number 1 in weekly sales, more than a year and a half had gone by since the game was first released. Pokemon might never have become such a huge hit if it wasn't for Mew, and probably never would have been localized into 6 languages and become the worldwide success it is today. One of the biggest urban legends was that Mew was hidden under a truck near the SS Anne, which you could only reach by engaging in a mild amount of tomfoolery. That was just a baseless rumor, of course. In reality, there was nothing anywhere near the truck. But the rumor eventually made it all the way to Game Freak HQ. So, in honor of the urban legends that inspired Mew in the first place, they hid an invisible lava cookie by the truck as an Easter egg in Fire Red and Leaf Green. And in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, they left a revive that respawns once a day in the exact same location. The rumor was also referenced in Pokemon XD, Gale of Darkness, where there's a beauty who says, "There's no Pokemon under a truck. Maybe you'll just find a muck." Fans seem to have fixated on that particular spot because it's the only truck in Kanto, which led them to believe it must have some significance. But actually, it's nothing more than a leftover from earlier in development. In 2019, red and green prototype assets were leaked and then published by preservationist group The Cutting Room Floor, including a proto-map of Kanto, which includes a small city in the center that was cut from the game's final build. This proto-map matches the 1990 concept art that labels the Lost City with the letter C. If we zoom in on the Lost City, we can see the exact same truck parked right out front. So after reworking Kanto, it appears Game Freak just never bothered to remove the old truck tile set from that rarely visited corner of the map. Or they might have even forgotten it was there. The legend of the truck and all the other urban legends about Mew were just a bunch of schoolyard rumors. The truth was that Mew could only really be accessed with a glitch. In those video interviews, Morimoto admits that he programmed the glitch into the games himself, although it was completely by accident. The mistake was mostly due to the fact he had virtually zero programming experience before working on Red and Green. But luckily, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as the Mew glitch was arguably the best thing that ever happened to Pokemon. Once the secret about Mew became public knowledge, Game Freak decided to host a Mew giveaway through Japanese magazine CoroCoro Comics. More than 70,000 fans mailed in letters hoping to acquire one of the only legitimate Mew in existence, but only 20 lucky winners were chosen. The number was kept so low because Morimoto had to personally create each Mew on his computer, then manually transfer them to the winner's cartridges with a standard Game Boy Link cable. He gave each Mew unique ID numbers ranging from 001 to 020, making them the rarest Pokemon to ever exist to this day. He still says Mew is his favorite Pokemon. Morimoto even made Mew part of his signature. Here you can see what it looks like when he signs his autograph. So Tajiri came up with the idea of Mew, and Morimoto made the design, stats, cry, and Pokedex entry. But the Mew he snuck into Red and Green was still far from finished. Like all Gen 1 Pokemon, Mew's sprite was designed first. Then art director Ken Sugimori came back later and made revisions with his watercolor artwork. Sugimori discusses this in depth in his 2014 art book, which we also translated into English. He says, each artist's sprites retain their individuality. The appeal of Pokemon comes from the wide range and diversity of designs. There's so many designs mixed together that couldn't have possibly all come from the same mind. But the only images for Pokemon we had were their sprites. so I had to draw them all anew based on the pixel art. I also modified design elements that I was displeased with. That's how they all became my characters in a way. And since then, I've been in charge of unifying the designs of all Pokemon. Apparently, the part Sugimori was displeased with was the fetus aesthetic, which he dialed down significantly. Through Sugimori's revisions and unification process, Morimoto's original design gradually evolved into a Mew that's barely recognizable as the same creature. In fact, we never even got to see Morimoto's Mew in the West, since that original sprite was only ever used in the Japanese red and green. But even after Tajiri, Morimoto, and Sugimori's contributions, Mew was still just a collection of images showing what it looked like from the front and from behind. Who created its three-dimensional appearance, its personality, and its trademark floaty movements? No one at Game Freak can take credit for those details. They were actually made 2 years later by OLM Inc., the animation team who worked on Mewtwo Strikes Back. On Game Freak's official channel, Morimoto looked back with amazement at how they brought his 40-pixel sprite to life. You know, that was the first Pokemon movie ever made, so I went to go see it, and I was like, whoa, Mew is moving. Mew has such a huge role in this movie. I made that Pokemon. It was very emotional. So much so that I watched it in America too. When you think about it, all I did was make the sprite. To see it move around was so cool. OLM's Sayuri Ichishi has confirmed that she was the one who drew Mew from every angle. She made these reference sheets for the first movie along with Mew's iconic animations. Sayuri was also animation director on the very first anime episode, and a big part of her job is taking Sugimori's still images and faithfully bringing them to life. He must be pretty satisfied with their work, because they've brought her back again and again. She's done animation for pretty much every Pokemon movie ever made. From the 80s arcade to the first movie's release in 1998, it took about 15 years for 4 creators driven by the urban legends spread by millions of fans to create the Mew we know today. In Pokemon lore, Mew gave birth to all life, but in reality, you could say it was all life who gave birth to Mew. Onto Mr. Nob Ogasawara, descended from Japanese Emperor Seiwa. The Ogasawaras are a samurai clan who once ruled over the Shinano province, as well as parts of Kyushu, the real-life basis for the Hoenn region. Born into Japanese nobility, and as the eldest son of an eldest son, Nob would someday inherit his father's title as feudal lord. But after Japan's defeat in World War II, a series of reforms stripped the Ogasawaras of their land and gave it to commoners, making their nobility entirely symbolic with no actual relevance in post-war Japan. In 1968, Nob's family moved to Canada to start a new life. Nob would grow up to become a translator and one day be hired by Nintendo of America to translate a new Game Boy game called Pocket Monsters Red and Blue. Over the next decade, he localized 26 Pokemon games into English almost single-handedly. To memorialize his efforts, 14 Pokemon games have non-playable characters named after him. He translated all of the game's small text, but the big text, like city and Pokemon names, were mostly handled by his boss, Hiro Nakamura, with some help from Nintendo Treehouse. But Nob did name some Pokemon and also came up with some names in development that were never used. Nob officially left the franchise after Pokemon Platinum, but today we've asked him to make a return in an unofficial capacity. Why? Because there were some Pokemon who never got English names. Pokemon that Game Freak created and gave Japanese names to, but scrapped in development before they ever went through the localization process. So in this video, we'll be discussing these lost Pokemon, their development history, lore, and entertaining a what-if scenario where they were never cut and Nob got the chance to name them. He just had one stipulation for us. He'd only name lost Pokemon who had official Japanese names because that's how the process worked back when he was Pokemon's official English localizer. That means some lost Pokemon who never had a name at all won't be covered. But before we get started, for clarity and legal purposes, we need to stress one more time. These are unofficial English names. And now that we have all that out of the way, let's begin. This flying fish Pokemon was found in leak files from early in Gen 2's development. And it was the only beta sprite in that particular leak that came with a name attached. Sato, which may have translated to fishbird. Nob gave it the self-explanatory name, Sailwing. In 2018, Gold and Silver's 1997 demo leaked online, revealing dozens of lost Pokemon the fanbase had never seen before. Chikorita was the grass starter in the demo, but instead of Cyndaquil, the original fire starter was Hinaguma, which roughly translates to fire bear. Nob calls it Coburn, another portmanteau, this time for cub, like a baby bear cub, and burn. Thanks to a series of leaked sprites, we can see that Coburn was gradually revised into Teddiursa over the next 2 years of Gold and Silver's development. Coburn evolves into Flambear, a combination of flame and bear, which together also sounds like flambe, a cooking method involving setting your food on fire. The family's final stage is Bruinus, a reference to Bruin, a folk word for bears as well as ruinous. Instead of a crocodile, the original water starter was based on a plesiosaur, a type of marine reptile that first came into existence about 200 million years ago and went extinct the same time that the dinosaurs did. Nob calls it Palcean, derived from pleasy as well as the word pal, because as a starter it would have been your little buddy. Its first evolution is Presea, and its final form is Donmarine, referencing a head honcho like a mafia don as well as submarines. Some fans believe they were scrapped in development for looking too much like Lapras, who's also based on a plesiosaur. But since Game Freak never officially addressed this leak, we can only speculate. The 1997 demo also introduced baby and fully evolved forms of Tangela, which Nob dubbed Burgala and Jungala. Burgala uses Tangela's jala suffix, and the prefix berg derives from bur, a type of seed, as well as the word burgeoning, which means to grow or flourish quickly, and Jungala is derived from jungle. Quillfish also had a scrapped evolution, Zeppala. The zap part comes from the lightning bolt on its forehead, and the overall name references its visual similarity to zeppelins. Interestingly, another Gen 2 leak contained what appears to be an even earlier beta sprite for Zappola, with a more simple blowfish design. This 3-stage family consists of a sunfish, a shark, and a gulper eel, with each stage representing a real-life animal that lives progressively deeper in the ocean. The first stage, Molambino, takes its name from the sunfish Mola Mola, as well as Bambino, the Italian word for a baby or child. The shark's Japanese name was Ikari, which translates to both anchor and rage. Its discovery in the demo led some fans to speculate that it was the original namesake for the Lake of Rage, which in Japanese is called Ikari no Mizumi. And if that's the case, the lake probably would have been full of Ikari, the anchor-tailed shark Pokemon. Nob calls it Angare, a mix between anchor, anger, and gore, like a gory shark attack. And its final evolution he calls Lureel, a portmanteau of lure, surreal, and eel. In the 1997 demo, Girafarig also had a pre-evolution, appearing to be a pair of conjoined twin giraffes. Nob calls them bipolar, derived from the words bipolar and polar, since they're pulling in 2 different directions. A leak from later in development actually shows a more refined design for bipolar, where they're still twin giraffes but no longer attached. The leaked file was dated June 1999, just 5 months before Gold and Silver released in Japan, so it seems bipolar almost made the cut but ended up getting scrapped in the 11th hour. Bipolar's design makes a little more sense when you realize that in the demo, Girafarig originally had 2 equally sized giraffe heads, which was pretty clever since both the English and Japanese names are spelled the same backwards and forwards, just like the design itself. The demo also contained a ditto evolution. Nob calls it Mimeo, named after mimeographs, machines that duplicate text, as well as the word mimic. It also ends with the O sound to match Ditto's name style. Just like its pre-evolution, Mimeo could only learn one move, transform. So its redundancy was probably why it didn't make Gen 2's final cut. It would have evolved from Ditto when it was traded holding a metal coat, so some fans have speculated that Mimeo influenced the design of Melton 2 decades later. These 2 Pokemon's true forms are kept intentionally mysterious, since they hide their real selves underneath the skin of a wolf. This may be why they ended up getting cut, as the existence of wolf pelts can raise some dark questions about the Pokemon world. Nob calls the first stage Warfers, a combination of were and furs, and its evolution is Whirlican, a mashup of were and lycanthropy, which is a word to describe werewolf transformations. Both names are also a play on Bofors and Oerlikon flak cannons, two brands of flak cannon common in World War II. Warfers and Werelikon were originally brown in Gold and Silver's 1997 demo, but Game Freak changed their colors to blue later on in production, presumably to reflect their ice typing. This Pokemon appears to be the creature latched onto Slowbro's tail, although its data in the demo doesn't indicate it was actually related to the Slowbro family, which could mean it was entirely independent, or Game Freak simply hadn't gotten around to programming the data just yet. Its Japanese name was Taibon, suggesting it's the turbine that Slowking wears on its head. So Nob gave it the English name Disturbin, a portmanteau of turban and disturb, as its very existence is somewhat disturbing, just like real turban snails. A family of dark-type felines had a bell theme and were only capable of being female. So Nob named the first stage Moybell, a combination of Mademoiselle and Belle, and its evolution he calls Beldame, a mashup of Belle, Dame, and Bedlam. Their signature move was Heal Bell, which can also be learned by the Skitty family, a moon-themed cat family introduced in Gen 3, who some fans suggest are sort of spiritual successors to the Moybell family. If it hadn't been cut, this bomb-carrying seal would have been the series' first dual-type water and fire Pokemon. Nob calls it Grenomari, short for grenade, marine, and mar, an old-fashioned word that means to inflict serious bodily harm or to destroy. A fitting description for what a bomb does. This one Nob called Bellinin, derived from bell, belligerent, and malignant. It would have been a branch evolution for Weepinbell when it touches a poison stone. In the final game, Sprout Tower's only 3 stories tall, but the internal data reveals lots of unused floors that would have made it 9 stories tall. This might explain why an NPC in the final game still says the tower's central pillar is a 100-foot-tall dead Bellsprout. Some fans speculate that Bellinin and the Poison Stone were originally meant to play a prominent role in this much larger version of Sprout Tower. In the game's final build, however, Bellinin and the Poison Stone got cut entirely, and the tower got shrunk down to just a third of its original size. There was actually an alternate Bellinin design discovered in a leak from much later in development, so it seems it was one of the last Pokemon to get removed from the game. These electric tigers are what Nob calls Tyker and Striger. Tyker is a portmanteau of tiger and tyke, a word for a small child. This was a name suggested to Nob by our artist Rachel Briggs years ago, and when we saw that he chose it for the video, we asked him not to use a fan name. But he said if a name was good, he actually would have been fine using a fan name back in the 90s. Striger is a combination of strike, tiger, and taiga, the winter forest biome where you can find Siberian tigers. One leak revealed Tyker and Striger were created during Red and Green's development, which means they actually got cut from 2 generations back to back. They even had an additional evolution in Gen 1, but only its back sprite was found in the leak, so we can only speculate about its frontal appearance. The leak also didn't include a name for the final stage, which means it won't be getting a name from Nob, since he's only giving English names to lost Pokemon with Japanese names. 2 decades before Farfetch had got an evolution in Generation 8, Game Freak almost gave us one in Gen 2. Nob calls it Luxswan, a combination of the words luxury and swan. It first appeared in Gold and Silver's 1997 demo, and later got an updated sprite with a new color scheme. But ultimately, Luxswan didn't make the final cut. Perhaps the creepiest Pokemon in the demo were these 2 ghosts based on Asian culture. The first stage is based on a bear and a Waraningyo, which is a straw doll that originated in Chinese rituals. They're also used in Japan, where they're nailed against trees to curse people, similar to how voodoo dolls work. It appears the attack curse was created as its signature attack, even though the straw doll Pokemon ended up getting cut. Curse still made it into the final game. Nob calls this one Strawman, derived from Strawman and Omen, like how bad omens foreshadow tragic events. Its evolution is both a panda and a Zhongshi, also known as a Chinese hopping vampire. Though their depictions vary from story to story, Jiangshi often wear traditional Chinese clothes and hop around with their arms outstretched, searching for victims to kill and absorb their qi. You can kill a Zhongshi by writing a spell on thin yellow paper and sticking it to their foreheads, which explains the little piece of paper incorporated into its design. Nob calls it Pandarin, a mashup of phantom, panda, and Mandarin, as in Mandarin Chinese. Strawman and Pandaren were cut pretty early on in Gen 2's development, probably due to their occult origins and being a little too creepy for the Pokemon brand. Scyther got a new evolution in Gen 2 in the form of Skyzor, and Pinsir was originally planned to receive one as well, which Nob calls Tricules, due to its 3 horns and the fact that it's based on a Hercules beetle. Its colors were changed from brown to pink later on before ultimately getting cut, just a few months before Gold and Silver's release, possibly to make room for Heracross, who's also based on a Hercules beetle. The demo had a total of 17 baby Pokemon, but apparently Game Freak decided that was too many, so they ended up cutting it down to just 7 in the final game. One of these lost babies was a 3-tailed Vulpix pre-evolution. Nob names it Vulpe III, with the 3 eyes referencing the Roman numeral for 3. Nob actually would have preferred to theme the whole family in this style, telling us, "I wish I could go back in time and convince them it could have been Vulp 5 and Vulpe 9, with Roman numerals representing the number of tails." Vulpe III was actually created and then cut during Gen 1, and later got cut again during Gen 2's development, just like these next 3 babies who also all got cut from both gens as well. Starting with Coinpur, a Meowth pre-evolution, who gets its name from coin purse and purr. Coinpur's sprite has 3 different coins above its head, but they're not present in its back sprite. This has led some fans to believe that they weren't actually a part of its design, but were placed there by designers as options so they could later pick which coin shape would appear on its forehead. Baby Ponyta was Coalta, derived from coal and colt, the word for a young horse. It also ends with te to match Ponyta. And Orphrey was Baby Goldeen, whose name comes from Or, which means gold, because the Goldeen family are all goldfish, as well as Fry, the word for a fish that has just hatched. The rest of these scrapped babies were only cut from Gen 2 and, as far as we can tell from all the leaks, were never intended for Gen 1. Baby Doduo is Doteri, beginning with Daid to match its evolutions, followed by Airy, which means bird's nest, and in Old English refers to a family of birds. Even though its 3 heads make for an interesting bird's nest motif, the fact that its evolutionary line would have gone from 3 heads to 2 heads to 3 again may raise some uncomfortable questions about where that 3rd head goes as Doduo, which might have been why it got cut. Paraspore gets its name from its evolution Paras and also the word spore. Paras and Parasect show a parasitic mushroom increasingly taking control over its host insect, but paradoxically, Paraspore appears to be growing out of its mushroom. This runs counter to the evolutionary narrative of its evolutions. And similar to Doteri, the fact that it doesn't quite make sense might explain why it didn't make the cut. Baby Grimer is called Smudge, whose name and design are both pretty self-explanatory. Smudge was originally pink, but in a later build had its color changed to gray, possibly to make it look less like Ditto, before the developers decided to remove Smudge from the game altogether. There's also a Growlithe pre-evolution, Puperon, derived from the word pup, and also pepperoni because it's a hot and spicy fire type. Another leak from earlier in Gen 2's production contained what appeared to be an even older design for Puperon. Unfortunately, that particular leak didn't include names or evolution data, so it's impossible to be 100% certain that it is in fact an early Puperon. And there's only one lost Unova Pokemon discovered so far that has a name, a dual-type grass and ground Pokemon labeled Nakoyagi, which is Japanese for root goat. It was shown for only a few seconds in a slideshow at Tokyo's Meiji University in 2010. With the help of Helix Chamber member Luminosis, we enhanced and translated that slide to get a better understanding of its concept, which may have eventually evolved into Gen 5's Sawsbuck or Gen 6's Gogoat, or possibly both. Nob calls it Tubacapra, named after root vegetable tubers, and also capra, the scientific word for goats. And just as importantly, it rhymes with Chupacabra, the mythical blood-sucking goat monster that was supposedly first spotted in Puerto Rico in 1995. The last Pokemon on our list is none other than Gorochu, the Raichu evolution cut from Gen 1. According to Game Freak's Koji Nishino, the developers had no choice but to remove several Pokemon from the game, as they'd run out of cartridge space. As a result, some 3-stage families got cut to just 2 stages. Not only Gorochu, but also some of the babies like Vulpe III and Coinpur. No concept art or front sprite were ever leaked or officially revealed by Game Freak. This artwork is based on its back sprite and a description by its creator, who told Japanese newspaper Yomiuri that it had fangs and horns and looked like a god of thunder. Since Pikachu and Raichu kept their original Japanese names in virtually every language around the world, it seems fitting to leave this one unchanged as well and refer to it simply as Gorochu. Did you know there's actually several Japan-exclusive Pokemon games on one of Nintendo's most beloved handhelds, the Game Boy Advance? Nintendo created several mini-games based on the Pokemon series for the GBA, but these weren't part of a standard retail release. They were distributed through the Pokemon Trading Card Game. Special edition cards were released for the TCG that could be scanned into the Nintendo e-reader. This was a device for the Game Boy Advance that could read encoded strips of data, similar to a magnetic strip reader on a credit card machine, which could scan a line of code from cards and then send that data to the GBA. Some of these cards would hold additional content for full retail titles, but in the case of Pokemon, some cards were released that held their own exclusive, fully fledged minigames. We say fully fledged, but they weren't exactly going to stun audiences with their incredible gameplay, though we wouldn't call them a waste of time either. A fair amount of these cards were released internationally, but Japan had a collection of promotional cards which never had any publication outside of the region. These include Exciting Hide and Seek. This one's less of a game and more of a simple animated cartoon, likely based on the animated short Pikachu's Peekaboo, known in Japan as Pikachu's Exciting Hide and Seek. There are two different possible versions of this animated skit involving Pikachu and Larvitar hiding from one another. Next is Imakani's Ball, based on the Ball Game & Watch title. It involves juggling balls by using the left and right buttons, though in this instance the player's character is replaced by Tomoaki Imakuni, a Japanese musician who performed several songs for the Pokemon anime and promotional material for the TCG. He was even featured on several Pokemon cards, including the card required to play this game. There's also Wooper's Juggling Game. Taking on the role of Wooper, the objective here is to use Wooper's water gun attack to keep Poliwag and Totodile off the ground. After a short while, Psyduck then gets dropped into the mix, with Poliwag falling faster than Totodile and Psyduck taking 2 blasts before being projected higher. Then there's Big Fruit Strategy. Here the player controls Totodile as the Mon swims in the water with the goal of collecting as much fruit as possible while avoiding a number of Tentacruel. The player then obtains different point values depending on which fruit is collected, and the game finishes once the player crosses the finish line of the course. And last but not least, there's Toko Toko Truck. This game has 2 Pichu riding a handcar while passing different train stations. Their final destination is the Pokemon Center in Tokyo, but they have to get there before time runs out by jumping over boulders left on the track along the way. There are plenty more Pokemon games exclusive to Japan, which we'll be covering in this video. As usual, will be extensive, but we won't be counting demos or games that later got a comprehensive release in other regions, such as Pokemon Stadium or Great Detective Pikachu, Birth of a New Duo, or even Pokemon Green, as the original Green and Red were basically just less polished versions of what we got in the West. We also won't be counting apps that have no game-like elements, like Pokemon PC Master, which essentially just taught kids how to use a PC. We'll also have one pretty unique game we want to talk about at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. Now we're trying not to be biased on this channel, but the next game we're talking about is definitely our favorite game in this video. The Pokemon Trading Card Game on the Game Boy was a huge change from the original games. Developed by Hudson, these games translated the mechanics of the Pokemon Trading Card Game into a video game format. The game received an international release to widespread acclaim, so it was surprising to learn that the game's sequel remains exclusive to Japan even to this day. Also by Hudson, Pokemon Card GB2. Here Comes Team GR boasted several new features and improvements over its predecessor. An optional choice of the player's gender was added, a training mode was included to teach people how to actually play the game properly, and a deck diagnosis system was introduced to rate the player's crafted deck. Compared to the first game, which had 228 cards, GB2 was bumped up to a total of 445 cards. Probably the most iconic card added to GB2 was Great Rocket's Mewtwo, which was featured prominently in the game. A real-life version of the card was distributed in Japan, bundled with special edition Celebi-themed Game Boy Advances, which means GR Mewtwo was Japan exclusive both physically and digitally. It wasn't just the card count that was increased, the size of the entire game was increased massively. Rather than a simple collect all the badges plot, A rival team was introduced known as Team Great Rocket, led by King Birurichi. This group kidnaps the club masters from around the island, featured in the original release, and steals everyone's cards. So the player assumes the role of a hero that sets off to rescue the masters and restore the status quo. Similarly to how Pokemon Gold and Silver introduced a second island, TCG GB2 is also made up of two different islands. The island featured in the first game and a second island called GR Island. This was partly to address a common complaint with the first game, its rather short playtime. The game's graphics were also noticeably improved, with areas having much more detailed theming, characters having more animations, and a new selection of coins for the player to use during match's initial coin toss. Another introduction to the card game sequel was a game corner, where the player is able to play a variety of minigames similar to that of the main series. This may be our bias speaking as fans of the Pokemon TCG game on the Game Boy, but this title is actually very enjoyable as a sequel, holding up even today. But this begs the question, why did it never see an English release? And sadly, this isn't a hard question to answer. Pokemon Card GB2 released at the late date of March 28, 2001, just a week after the release of the Game Boy Advance. With the original Pokemon TCG Game Boy release taking years to be localized outside of Japan, if this title was localized into English, it probably would have been released in 2002, or perhaps even 2003. That means this sequel would have been in direct competition with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. And with GB2 essentially being twice the size of the original game, it would have been more prudent for Nintendo to put those localization resources toward a GBA game instead. Lucky for the Pokemon franchise, the collectible creatures managed to become such a strong brand, they didn't have to be constrained to one genre, or even popular genres. The world of sports saw its own Pokemon game with extremely limited availability. Poke Park Fishing Rally DS was available for just a few months in 2005 and could only be obtained through the DS Download Play kiosk. These kiosks could originally be found in Poke Park, a theme park dedicated to the franchise, though they would later be placed in Japanese Pokemon Center stores and at Pokemon Festa, an annual Pokemon convention. The title's gameplay takes place on a river flowing into the sea, with the area changing over time. The top screen would display the shadows of different Pokemon underwater, and the player must cast their line onto the screen, pressing the A button when the floater is pulled under, and then repeatedly tapping to pull in the catch. Each Pokemon caught is displayed on the touchscreen, with their different scores being shown on the top screen based on the size of the Pokemon, level, and rarity. Scores would be tallied at the end of play, with the top 50 scores being sent back to the kiosk and placed upon a scoreboard shown on screen. Not only is the game limited in its release, only being available via a region-specific kiosk, but there was also no means of actually storing the game, meaning that should the player's DS be shut down, it could no longer be played. While one could in theory keep their DS powered up and the game left running at all times, it would still be unavailable long-term as the game was also restricted to a 12-hour time limit. Partly due to its limited distribution and semi-permanent state, the title has now become lost media, with the only known ROM being held by a private collector who refuses to make the ROM public despite constant requests from the community. Although he did, at the very least, record himself playing the game to give us a better look at how it functioned. But some of Japan's Pokemon exclusives were on popular hardware. Very popular hardware. The region received 3 versions of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon created exclusively for the Nintendo Wii, made available as WiiWare downloadable titles on the Nintendo Shop channel in late 2009 for 1,200 Wii points, or about $12 each. These titles were Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Keep Going, Blazing Adventure Squad, Let's Go, Stormy Adventure Squad, and Go For It, Light Adventure Squad. Developed by Chunsoft, these entries mark the only time that Mystery Dungeon has appeared on a home console. They're also the only entries in the sub-series not to receive an international release. Often referred to as the Adventure Squad series, and contrary to other Mystery Dungeon games, these 3 titles put little emphasis on storyline. The game's plot starts with a group of Pokemon being sent by Slowking to rescue a lost Shuckle. After returning to town, he explains that he was searching for some delicious food, a story that will continue to unfold as progress is made. This then opens up the game's bulletin board where Pokemon post requests for the player to undertake in exchange for a reward. Depending on which of the 3 iterations of the game is being played, the hub world will differ. For Blazing Squad, the location is a Pokemon village near a volcano. In Stormy Squad, the player is based at Pokemon Beach. And for Light Squad, the hub is a Pokemon garden held within a forest. The games made use of the same 3D graphics featured in My Pokemon Ranch, another WiiWare release which simplified the graphical style of each Pokemon. According to IGN, the game's developers were aiming for something which resembles a picture book. Additional missions can be added to the game through the Wii's Wii Connect 24 feature, which will download while the Wii is in sleep mode. For a short period after the game released, several promotional codes were distributed as well, which could be entered through the game's Wonder Mail menu. These codes could be used to unlock unique Pokemon, who the player could then use throughout the dungeons. These titles never saw a release outside of Japan, but this doesn't mean that they were never intended to be translated. Copyright filings were made in the US for each game's title, not just with their direct translations, but also a second set of filings for reimagined subtitles which put the elements at the end of their names. The names were Forward, Adventurers of Flame, Let's Go, Adventurers of Storm, and Aspire, Adventurers of Light. During development, IGN reported on the games multiple times, assuming that they'd receive international localization. But this never came to fruition. To many, the lack of a stateside release was surprising, seeing as the Pokemon franchise has always had a strong following in the West, and the Wii had a massive install base in 2009 and 2010. So why the game never surfaced in the West remains a bit of a mystery. In a positive turn of events, though, a team of people at Project Pokemon released translation patches for all 3 games, making them playable in English over a decade after their original release. These translation patches not only aim to localize the game in a manner similar to that of previous official English releases, but also brought back almost all of the online features, including downloadable event missions and legendaries. Moving on from Pokemon games on popular hardware to Pokemon games on a console which some people have never heard of, the Sega Pico saw an exceptionally limited release worldwide, but was particularly popular with Japanese schoolchildren. Despite their association with Nintendo, the owners of the Pokemon brand, the Pokemon Company, aren't exclusively controlled by Nintendo. They have the option to create products branching across multiple video game platforms, which allows the series to reach a wider audience than just those interested in Nintendo hardware. Before we explain the Pico's Pokemon games, we should first give a brief introduction of what on earth the Sega Pico even is and where it came from. The Pico was released in Japan in 1993 and saw an international release a year later in 1994. The system held some mild success for a number of years, though it was ultimately discontinued outside of Japan in 1998. In Japan, however, the system continued to see support until as late as 2005. As of April 2005, 3.4 million Pico consoles had been sold at retail, with over 11 million software sales across 300 different pieces of software. The Pico hardware was derived from that of the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, though differed dramatically in control and function. The Pico is shaped somewhat like a laptop, but without a screen or full keyboard, instead having a pad controlled by a magic pen, as well as some colored directional buttons. Cartridges for the console aren't actually cartridges in the traditional sense either. Referred to as storyware, each game comes in the form of a picture book with a slot on the bottom, which connects to the top half of the system, with the game progressing as each page of the book is turned. While the system saw a limited international release, none of the Pokemon titles made for the system were ever localized in the West. One of these region-locked titles was Pokemon Catch the Numbers, which released July 23, 2002, and featured the second generation of Pokemon. It was designed to teach children numeracy skills, with the story following Pikachu and Togepi after Team Rocket steals all of Ash, Misty, and Brock's other Pokemon. The player is faced with a selection of mini-games that must be completed in order to retrieve the lost companions. As a side note, within the data of Catch the Numbers, a sprite of a Weezing can be found which would ultimately never be used in-game. Another title is Pokemon Advanced Generation, I've Begun, Hiragana, and Katakana, which released November 17, 2003, and used the third generation of Pokemon. It was designed to teach Japanese children how to read and write Hiragana and Katakana script. The story again involves Team Rocket, with them deceiving Ash, Brock, May, and Max by disguising themselves and telling them that they need 25 Pokemon to progress to the Pokemon stage. Each Pokemon is caught by correctly drawing 5 Kana. If Pokemon on the Sega console wasn't enough, the Pikachu Pico was a Pikachu-branded Pico released in 2004, a year before the end of the Pico's life cycle. This system had no technical differences from the standard Pico console and was made solely as a way of boosting the system's sales. The console came bundled with a copy of Pokemon Advanced Generation, I've Begun, Hiragana, and Katakana. And the last game published on the standard Pico was Pokemon Advanced Generation, Pico for Everyone Pokemon Loud Battle, released on July 13, 2004. The game again includes the third generation of Pokemon. The game stars Ash, Brock, May, and Team Rocket, and is mainly based around reading and playing minigames. The title came with a Pikachu-themed controller featuring various minigames that were playable in a competitive two-player mode, with both players using either side of the controller. Inevitably, the Sega Pico would come to the end of its life cycle in 2005, but the Pico brand wouldn't be entirely scrapped. Instead, a new and improved follow-up to the console was created for the Japanese market. This successor, the Advanced Pico Bina, released in 2005 and often referred to simply as the Bina, featured designs very similar to the original system, though the Bina featured an additional set of buttons on its right side to accommodate left-handed children, as well as built-in speakers and new ports for add-ons such as an SD card reader, which can be used to save game progress and store images. And of course, the Bina got more Pokemon titles. Pokemon Advanced Generation, Pokemon Number Battle, released on October 1st, 2005. The game uses the third generation of Pokemon. It mostly involves finding hidden Pokemon in various scenes, as well as solving math questions and puzzles. After this, intellectual training drill Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Letter and Number. Intelligence game was released on April 21st, 2007, and featured the fourth generation of Pokemon. The game was geared towards teaching children general knowledge, words, and numbers, asking them to do tasks such as counting Pokemon and grouping them together based on on-screen prompts. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Search for Pokemon. Adventure in the Maze was released on September 17, 2009, again using the fourth generation Pokemon. This title seems to focus more on the Pokemon brand itself, with the player having to use the book to highlight Pokemon either based on their silhouettes or finding them in on-screen mazes. The game also encourages children to learn the Pokemon by name alone, rather than relying entirely on images. And lastly, Pokemon Best Wishes. Intelligence Training. Pokemon Big Sports Meet was released on December 4th, 2010, and included Generation 5 Pokemon. The player takes on the role of Ash through various games, which involve learning hiragana, numbers, and English, as well as completing a number of exercises in order to win medals. Through the use of the SD card reader sold separately, it is possible to save and print images created in-game. Our next game that never left the land of the rising sun was also educational, well, sort of. After the success of the first generation titles, Pokemon had solidified itself as a huge player in gaming. Nintendo naturally wanted to capitalize on the series' fame and injected Pokemon into its new series of Picross titles, the Picross NP series. The series was exclusively available via download using the Nintendo Power Service in 1999 in Japan. The service allowed players to store a game on a blank Super Famicom cartridge using an in-store kiosk and take it home with them. Picross NP Volume 1, the first in the series, kicked things off by putting Pokemon front and center. In total, the game features 12 different Pokemon-based puzzles, one each for Meowth, Mr. Mime, Psyduck, the Clefairy Doll, Togepi, Electrode, Gloom, Pikachu, Zapdos, Rapidash, Poliwag, and Snorlax. Since the Picross NP series was made exclusively for the Nintendo Power Service, and the service never left Japan, it's safe to bet that this is why the series never came to the West. You could argue that Nintendo could have just slapped all 8 Picross NP titles on a cartridge in English for a quick buck, but 1995's Mario's Picross was a flop in both the US and Europe. This would make an English localization of Picross NP a risky move, one that probably wasn't worth it. Remember that awesome trading card game we talked about earlier? Well, there were a couple more trading card games that stayed with Japanese audiences exclusively, though they lacked a fully fledged adventure mode like Pokemon Card GB2. One of these TCG titles was a Japanese exclusive browser game called Pokemon Card Game Online, which released in 2009. Be sure not to mistake this game for the similarly titled Pokemon Trading Card Game Online, which is entirely different. Built in Flash, this massively multiplayer online card game is simply a means of playing the physical card game with others across the internet, utilizing unique access codes included with Leafeon versus Metagross Expert Deck CD-ROMs. For users with a Pokemon Daisuke Club account, signing up for the service also deposited 2,000 action points, the in-game currency, into their account for use via the club's action point system. This game would allow players to use fixed decks against other players, made up of cards included in their pack purchase. The service only ran for about a year before being discontinued. A few years later, the West would get the aforementioned Pokemon Trading Card Game Online, making a localization of this original title redundant. Yet another card game entry was Pokemon Card Game, How to Play DS in 2011, which served, unsurprisingly, as a means of teaching the player the rules of the card game, but on Nintendo DS. The game includes a digital rulebook covering how to play, along with a variety of tutorials. Once completed, 5 CPU-controlled opponents will become available to practice with. The game boasted a pretty neat feature, however, making use of the DS download play function, allowing 2 players to compete against one another with only 1 cartridge. The title even came packaged with 90 real Pokemon cards, so you could take that sweet TCG knowledge you just learned out into the real world with you. Though Pokemon is at home on handhelds, many in the West didn't realize that the Pokemon franchise actually had moved to the mobile market earlier than the launch of smartphones. Not only that, but the first mobile application for the series wasn't even created by Nintendo, but rather Square Enix. Released in 2006, Pokemate was a phone application that let players send and receive messages with friends or participate in live chat, but also catch and store Pokemon. When starting the game, the player is given a random Pokemon along with 10 Pokeballs to capture more. Rather than utilizing mechanics of fighting or leveling, instead the game serves as a virtual pet simulator, with the player caring for their caught Pokemon just like a Tamagotchi. Players were encouraged to sign up for the game's subscription service, which would grant them additional Pokeballs, extra media features, and the ability to catch more than just 3 Pokemon. While only released in Japan, the game was demonstrated in the US during E3 2006, with many assuming a worldwide launch would be coming at some point. As the result of low interaction from users, the service was discontinued in 2008. Around that time, it would have been unlikely to see an international release. The game can no longer be accessed, and all that remains are a limited number of videos and screenshots, making this another piece of Pokemon lost media. Pokemon's return to the mobile market came with the launch of smartphones. In 2011, Pokemon Say Tap became the second Pokemon mobile game after Pokemate, and is even more limited in scope. Developed by Creatures Inc., the application is a rhythm game based on the trading card game. The goal revolves around tapping cards displayed on screen in time to the music and icons as they pass a circle. More points are awarded according to accuracy for the player's timing. This simple feat becomes less impressive after finding out there is only a single song available to play, and it's the ending theme to the Japanese anime at the time of its release. Can you name all the Pokemon? BW. In a similar vein, just a few years later in 2015, dancing, Pokemon Band took the concept a step further. The player takes control of a Pokemon summoned by Hoopa and must tap 3 different icons, donning different Pokemon faces as musical notes pass over them, with more points being awarded for better timing. Each correctly timed tap fills a meter at the top of the screen, which when maxed out causes 2 additional Pokemon to jump on screen for a 10-second dancing round, where buttons can be tapped freely before the song finishes. After the game ends, the player is given a rank and a picture with different amounts depending on score. These can then be spent to unlock additional Pokemon to play as across the game's selection of 4 songs and 3 stages. There are also 3 additional Pokemon that could be unlocked by entering special passwords revealed across Pokemon shows on TV. Pokemon Say Tap and Dancing, Pokemon Band were only made available for a few months in 2011 and 2015 respectively, and as such were never brought to the West. One could assume that around the mid-2010s, limited releases of internationally renowned series would become an outdated practice. But that simply wasn't the case for Pokemon. The series continued to see more games that never got localization, despite the clear appetite for their availability among fans. A free downloadable Pokemon game limited to Japan was released for the 3DS in 2014. Developed by Marvelous, called Pokemon the Movie Diancie and the Cocoon of Destruction, The Thieves and the Thousand Pokemon, the game's plot revolves around recovering stolen diamonds, supplementing the plot of the 17th Pokemon movie. Essentially, a group of thieves has been using their Pokemon to steal valuable diamonds from the Diamond Domain, where they are used as a form of energy. The player takes control of a squad of Chespin, Fennekin, and Froakie, with one designated as their leader, to recover the stolen artifacts and return them to their rightful place. Players are initially given 50 of whichever starter Pokemon they choose, which can then be taken into a stage as a spendable resource. Additional Pokemon are obtained through Street Pass or by spending the Nintendo 3DS's Play Coins. The Pokemon obtained via Street Pass will be whichever starter Pokemon the passing player chose as their leader, while the Play Coins are redeemed to obtain more of the player's initial choice. Before selecting a stage, the player must designate how many Pokemon they intend to take with them, with any remaining Pokemon after a stage's completion being lost. Stages are made up of different challenge types, with 3 different types in total: battle, sneaking, and obstacle clearing. Battle stages involve the player defeating Pokemon in order to advance through a stage, with a battle gauge on top of the screen indicating how the fight is going. If the bar reaches the left, the player loses. If the bar reaches the right, they win. This is manipulated by sending additional Pokemon into the fight, while the enemy may also send in additional reinforcements, with type effectiveness having influence over each squad's power. After each fight, the player may lose a number of their Pokemon. Sneaking challenges have the player attempt to use stealth to bypass a fight by holding down the X, Y, or A button. Chespin, Fennekin, and Froakie will attempt to sneak past the opponent, only successfully getting past if they cross a threshold. If the button is released before they make it, they will retreat back to their starting position. The guarding Pokemon may stir and check behind them. If they see any of the player's squad making an approach, the stage will change into a battle scenario. If they don't spot anything, they will move closer to the player's starting position until eventually they spot the player's team and commence in a battle. Obstacle clearing stages face the player against objects which must be cleared by sending Pokemon in. A gauge on top of the screen will indicate progress, though unlike a battle, there is never any pushback. No Pokemon are lost during these challenges either, so it's more a sort of gate that can only be passed by having enough Pokemon to meet the threshold. If at any point during a stage the player chooses to stop their progress, the group of Pokemon that have been sent in will remain at the point at which the player quit, being able to rejoin the squad once they've reached that point of the stage again. As a result of the Pokemon being expended after a stage, a player's Pokemon count will become limited before long, leading to them needing to seek out other players to obtain more via Street Pass or bolstering their initial leader Pokemon via Play Coins. This results in the game being almost impossible to complete in a single sitting, forcing it to be played over multiple days at least in order to progress. Initially, only stages 1 through 16 are available to the player, covering the story of Marilyn and Riot, who appeared in the 17th movie. Additional stages surrounding Argus and Millis are unlocked after Stage 6, while 4 additional stages could be downloaded by players that attended a screening of Diancie and the Cocoon of Destruction in theaters or other special events. By completing these locked stages, a code is awarded to the player to unlock an additional Master Ball that can be used in Pokemon X and Y. The Thieves and the Thousand Pokemon is the most recent regional exclusive Pokemon title in this video, but there's one game we didn't mention yet, and it comes with a request for help and a $550 bounty. A demo for a PC edition of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, subtitled Gold Rescue Team, was released in the midst of 2007. It was available exclusively in Korean, with the demo being distributed as a free download to anyone who made an account on the Korean Mystery Dungeon website. The demo size invokes an interesting possibility. Being 450 megabytes, the demo took up far more space than what is needed for the limited segment that is playable, leading many in the community to believe that this data may actually contain the full game. Information on this game is immensely scarce, with the only real discussions around it being held on Korean message boards, with essentially no preservation of the original files. Did you know the Johto region was heavily inspired by the Kansai region of Japan? With Ekritak City, the region's cultural center, being based on Kyoto. Kyoto is famous for its traditional Japanese architecture and sites of historical and religious significance. Among these sites are the two Buddhist temples that lie to the northeast and northwest of the city. To the east lies Ginkaku-ji, or the Temple of the Silver Pavilion, known for the statue of a silver bird that sits atop its roof. To the west lies Kinkaku-ji, or the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which has a statue of a bronze phoenix on top. Kinkaku-ji was actually burned down by a novice monk in 1950, but was soon repaired in 1955. If you've played Pokemon Gold, Silver, or Crystal, this should sound familiar to you. The two towers of Ekritak City were based on these two real-life Buddhist temples, and are famous for the legendary birds that were said to roost on top of them. Ho-Oh perched atop the bell tower to the east, and Lugia perched atop the brass tower to the west. However, Lugia fled to the Whirl Islands when the brass tower burned down under mysterious circumstances, which is a clear reference to Kinkaku-ji. Something worth noting is the fact that Ho-Oh and Lugia seem to have swapped places from their real-life counterparts. Ho-Oh is associated with the bell tower to the east, while the bronze phoenix sits atop the western temple. Lugia was associated with the brass tower to the west, while the silver bird is located to the east. In a previous episode, we mentioned that the legendary Pokemon Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza were based on the Behemoth, Leviathan, and Ziz of Jewish mythology. These were said to be gargantuan monsters that dominated the land, sea, and sky respectively. There are differing accounts of the creatures' eventual fates. Some stories say that God will slay these creatures and serve them at the Messianic banquet, a banquet shared between God and the righteous. Other accounts state that the Behemoth and Leviathan will slay one another before they are served at the banquet. This latter account seems to be the inspiration for the battle that takes place between Groudon and Kyogre in Pokemon Emerald. Additionally, Ziz is said to be the messenger of God. This is perhaps reflected in the game's depiction of Rayquaza as being the only thing that can quell Groudon and Kyogre's wrath. If that weren't enough, Generation 3 also included Regirock, Regice, and Registeel, Pokemon that are based on the Jewish myth of the Golem. The Golem was a crude image of a man constructed from clay and brought to life. In the Middle Ages, it was commonly believed that the Golem could be brought to life and controlled by using any one of God's names. God's name was to be written on a piece of paper and either inserted into the mouth of the Golem or placed on the Golem's forehead. This legend evidently had an impact on the design of the Pokemon as well, as each of the legendary Golems has writing on their heads that bears a resemblance to Braille. The Pokemon Arceus is said to be the creator of the Pokemon world, having created Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, 3 Pokemon that control time, space, and antimatter respectively. Arceus also created the Lake Guardians of Sinnoh, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, that brought knowledge, emotion, and willpower into the world. Appropriately, Arceus appears to be based on various creation myths from world mythology. Most prominently, it appears to be loosely based on the creation myth from Shinto mythology, which states that before heaven and earth were divided, they were a chaotic formlessness described as a cosmic egg. Eventually, the pure part of this egg was drawn out to become heaven, and the impure part became earth. Afterward, divine beings were created, starting with the being Kunitokatachi no Mikoto. This being created 2 more deities known as Izanagi no Mikoto and Izanami no Mikoto. These 2 beings, using the Spear of Heaven, created the mythical island known as Onogoro-jima and erected a great pillar in the middle of this island. The Shinto creation myth and Sinnoh's creation myths share many similarities. Arceus's Pokédex entry in Pokemon Platinum reads, "It is said to have emerged from an egg in a place where there was nothing, then shaped the world." Arceus's creation of Dialga and Palkia to rule over time and space is similar to the creation of Izanagi and Izanami. Finally, Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, and through hacking even Arceus itself, are all encountered at the top of Mount Coronet in an area called the Spear Pillar. The Spear Pillar sits at the center of Sinnoh and was said to be the point of Sinnoh's creation. Onogoro-jima was created by a spear and a great pillar was erected at its center, hence Spear Pillar. Arceus also takes some inspiration from Buddhist mythology. Its Pokemon Diamond Pokédex entry states, "It is described in mythology as the Pokemon that shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms." The image of a deity with 1,000 arms is evocative of Avalokiteshvara, the personification of perfect compassion in Buddhism. Avalokiteshvara aspires to help all sentient beings be free of samsara, the endless cycle of reincarnation. Another possible connection between Arceus and Buddhism is the wheel on its back, which is reminiscent of the Dharma chakra, the wheel of the Dharma, which represents the path to nirvana. Two of the starter Pokemon from Generation 4 are also based on world mythology. Torterra is based on the myth of the world turtle that can be found in many mythologies around the world. For example, Chinese mythology states that the creator goddess Nuwa used the legs of a giant tortoise to prop up the sky. Certain Native American mythologies tell of a giant turtle that supports the entire earth upon its back. Torterra's Heart Gold and Soul Silver Pokédex entry reads, "Ancient people imagined that beneath the ground, a gigantic Torterra dwelled," explicitly referencing its real-world inspiration. Infernape may be based on Hanuman, a Hindu god that appeared in the Hindu epic poem Ramayana. Hanuman was a monkey that was granted immunity to burning by the deity of fire, Agni. He famously caused massive destruction to the mythical city of Lanka when he was held captive and his tail lit on fire. As the fire could not harm him, he escaped and used his tail to burn down large parts of the city. While the legendary Pokemon Keldeo was based on D'Artagnan from the Three Musketeers, it may have also been inspired by Scottish mythology. The Kelpie was a water spirit that often took the form of a beautiful horse in order to lure people into a watery grave. Its methods of doing so differ between accounts, but it would generally lure men into riding on its back before galloping across the waves. Keldeo is also able to run across water. Its Pokédex entry in Pokemon White states that it crosses the world, running over the surfaces of oceans and rivers. There are over 30 Mario video games that America never got, or that there's a canceled Zelda game for the DS that no one had ever heard of until a few weeks ago. Let us know what your favorite games are and what you want to hear about next in the comments below, and thanks for watching.